Hello everyone, good evening and welcome to another special book events for Dymocks Chapter 1. My name is Jamila Rizvi and of course to my, I'm not even going to figure out what way you're seeing it. To my left or my right is Prime Minister Julia Gillard. Before we kick off, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose traditional lands I am coming to you live today. I know it's still a little bit unusual for us to be working out how we acknowledge country when Julia and I are in different places and all of you are in different places. But the best I've come up with is to acknowledge where I am. Julia's in Adelaide.
I am.
Now, Beyonce might have said that girls run the world, but the central question of women in leadership is why, in reality, so few women continue not to hold positions of political power. Now, Julia is, of course, Australia's first woman Prime Minister, and she and her co-author, former Nigerian Finance Minister Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, have set out to test various hypotheses about women's leadership in this book. Julia, welcome to Facebook Live.
Thank you, Jamila. Great to be with you.
Now, I was going back through the archives a little bit, and in your first major interview after becoming PM, you told Kerry O'Brien on the 7:30 report that it was a good day for redheads. It seemed to me that it was a good day for women. And I wanted to ask, was that something you tried to avoid talking about? Did you try to avoid talking about gender in those early months of being Prime Minister?
I wouldn't have said that I tried to avoid talking about it. I just didn't think that I needed to. It was so obvious that I was the first woman to hold the position as Prime Minister. Everybody else was talking about it, some with great delight because they were very much pleased to see a woman do the job, others a little bit discomforted. And I thought to myself in those early days, look, there will be a lot of focus around being the first woman, and then that will kind of wane and I'll get on with the job of being Prime Minister, and then it will be politics as usual. It'll be about the issues, yes, about personalities and things like that, but that I wouldn't be treated differently than any Prime Minister in the past had been. So, the error I made wasn't that I consciously thought to myself, don't talk about gender, don't talk about gender. It was that I thought I didn't need to.
Mm-hmm. Now, nonetheless, gender and leadership have become a passion of yours in your post-politics career. You've written a book on the subject. You host a podcast where you interview women of influence from all over the world, and you do such important work at King's College in London. What's drawn you to questions of gender in this post-politics period of your life?
Well, when I left office, obviously I'd been wrong about that early judgment call. And in fact, the longer I was Prime Minister, the more and more there was a focus on gender, and the sort of insults of choice as the days went on tended to be the sorts of insults that only get hurled at women. So I lived through that experience. When I came out of it and wrote my first book, My Story, which was about my time in politics, I wanted to write thoughtfully on the question of gender. And I still had this issue going around in my head, how much of this was because I was a woman, how much was because it was me, how much because it was the political times, can you disaggregate that? And to try and do that, I looked at the global research about women in politics to try and work out what's the gendered bit. And the more I looked, really, the more intrigued I got. And ultimately that led me to pitch this idea to King's College London that we create a global institute for women's leadership to drill down into questions surrounding women and leadership, not just in politics, but across the board. And fortunately, we're now developing a sister institute at the Australian National University. But with all of that, I still thought, look, I can make a contribution here. I became very friendly with Ngozi. She was musing through the same issues. So we thought, let's kind of write a book. Let's try and tease this out.
Now, I want to get deep into the book because I have a lot of questions, but I first wanted to ask whether or not it surprised you that the misogyny speech became such a defining moment of your Prime Ministership. And I wanted to ask further that, did it kind of disappoint you that that was always the focus after you left government rather than the achievements of the government?
I've been through a sort of cycle with this. That was really a figure of 8, wasn't it? But a cycle. And no, I didn't think that it would live for as long as it has lived. I mean, here we are, all these years later, obviously 10 years since I was sworn in as Prime Minister, coming up to 8 years since I gave the misogyny speech. And if anybody had said to me back then, wow, you'll still be talking about all of this in 2020, I would have said, no, that's not right. That's not
possible. I have it on the tea towel.
Yeah. And people are using, misogyny tea towels, and they're on TikTok and they're using it as the mantra for how long they should be washing their hands during a pandemic, all of the above. I never foresaw any of that. But, and in terms of it defining my period in politics, I've sort of been through a cycle with this. For a while, to be frank, it did frustrate me. And particularly when I started to travel a great deal internationally after I left politics, people would run across a road in London or Washington or wherever I was to talk to me about the misogyny speech. And I would kind of be there saying, that's really nice. It's nice you recognise me. It's nice you're praising me for a speech. But I was in politics for 15 years. I was Deputy Prime Minister for 3. I was Prime Minister for 3. More things happened than this one speech. But the longer it went on, the more I became reconciled to it. And particularly reconciled to its international reach. I mean, many of the people who would come and talk to me, and still do when I'm travelling, when you're allowed to travel, talk to me about the misogyny speech. It's actually the only thing they know about me. It's the only thing they know about Australian politics. And other than the real basics like koalas and kangaroos, it's basically the only thing they know about Australia. So you've got to be pretty proud of that.
Go with it, I say. Now,
yeah.
For this new book, you've spoken to a number of women leaders and heard about their experiences firsthand. Did those conversations reveal anything to you about how women might lead differently to men?
Yes, it did. And it was both the conversations and looking at the research. I'm not a believer that, women's brains are somehow wired differently than men's brains. I mean, I know we've been steeped in a lot of that, the sort of, men are from Mars, women are from Venus analysis. We unpack a lot of that in the book and end up concluding that it's neurosexism, not neuroscience. But it is true to say that, from their earliest days, when someone first asks, was it a boy or a girl, we're socialised differently. And we're perceived differently. So people will look at male and female leaders differently, and they will react badly to a woman who seems to have given up on all of the traits that they stereotypically associate with women. So for women leaders to succeed, they've got to be able to show a caring, empathetic, nurturing side, as well as the strength to be a leader. They can't just show strength. That will get an adverse reaction. So the research led us to asking women leaders about those questions, and all of them, 8 women from very different parts of the world, very different experiences, all said that they felt that in their lives and their leadership, and indeed that they had limited some behaviours because they were conscious of that.
One of your hypotheses in Women in Leadership is about this kind of go girl attitude. And I'm a child of the 90s. I was squarely raised on the Spice Girls and the girls could do anything kind of mantra. Do you think that kind of encouragement when we're talking to kids is helpful, or does that kind of trick little girls into thinking they're going to be equal in a world where inevitably they're going to be treated otherwise?
Oh, I think it's really important to give girls a lot of confidence about the world and to show them every sort of, role model and, get them to aspire about what they want to do. And a common factor for all of our leaders, and we're talking about, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, born in Liberia, Joyce Banda from Malawi, through to Hillary Clinton, Jacinda Ardern, Erna Solberg in Norway, Theresa May, and the list goes on. So these are women born into vastly different circumstances. But a common factor was they were never told you can't. They weren't hothouse to be leaders. No one in their family was saying, unless you're president or prime minister, you'll be a failure and this family will disown you. It was never like that, but they were never told you can't. And that permission to think big, to dream big, made a real difference in their lives. But in the book, we actually talk about how even when, that's the messages that kids are getting at home, girls are getting at home, how gendered stereotypes creep in. And so I think we've got to strike a balance between the go for it, but understand there will still be some extra things that happen because you're a woman, because you're a girl, and maybe let's talk about how to prepare for those things. So it's a go for it message, but also understand the environment message.
I suppose because otherwise there's a danger that, you know, girls as they're growing up and leaving school and going into the workplace, that they blame themselves for that sexism, that they internalise it and go, oh, well, there's something wrong with me.
That's right, and we don't want that, them not to see it and to think that it's something to do with a deficiency in them. We also don't want them to be disillusioned the first moment that it strikes them, because we'll lose a lot of potential aspirants for leadership, people, you know, women who could make a real contribution because they've hit that first hurdle and don't have the skills to unpack it and the knowledge to combat it, and we're trying to get that across.
For those of you who are just joining us, my name's Jamila Rizvi, and of course tonight my guest for Dymocks Chapter 1 is Julia Gillard, former Prime Minister and co-author of Women and Leadership. We're having a very important discussion about women and leadership and politics and issues, and now I want to talk about hair.
Of course.
You do in the book quote Hillary Clinton, that apparently she used to joke when she was Secretary of State that if she wrote a book about that period of time, she'd call it the Scrunchy Chronicles, 112 countries, and it's still all about the hair. Now, scrunchies have made a really big comeback in the last 12 months, so that suddenly is quite pertinent. But I want to ask you, Julia, what do you think is the fascination with women leaders' looks? From the research that you've been doing with Ngozi, where does that come from? And I'd also love to hear your reflections on how it's played out for you personally.
Sure. Look, I think it comes from a variety of sources, some of them more obvious than others. I mean, the most obvious is that women leaders are still unusual. We see far more men in public leadership positions, political leadership positions. So the women are going to get more attention. Second, men basically get the benefit of a uniform, you know, suit, tie, in some countries of the world, some form of traditional dress. So you will see, for example, you know, Prime Minister Modi of India wearing a traditional Indian costume. But it's still a uniform, and really the uniform doesn't vary all that much. I mean, maybe you could bust out a kooky tie one day, but really it's... Do
you remember when Obama wore the tan suit? And it made headlines around the world for like 3 days.
I do. No, I do. I remember that. And it, you know, Obama was famous for the saying to, I think it was to Vanity Fair, that I wear the same thing every day and I eat the same thing every day because I have to make a lot of decisions, and they're important decisions about my leadership of the United States and obviously being one of the most important leaders in the world. And so the more decisions I can take out of my day, the better. So always wear the same thing, always eat the same thing. And then one day he busted out the tan suit and it sort of broke the internet. And on the anniversary of that day, I don't know if you've noticed, Jamila, this is a little bit off topic, but on the anniversary of that day each year, there's memes that go around the United States saying, do you remember when this was a political scandal? You know, we used to have humble little scandals like the president wearing a tan suit compared with what happens now. So,
a bit quaint, isn't it?
A very celebrated incident. But yeah, I think that's another element. You know, women don't get the benefit of the uniform, and women's dress is more varied and more variation is expected. It's not simply, you know, a suit for daytime and maybe a black tie for a big function. There's lots of variety. But I also think there's two deeper factors. One, we have more than one standard of acceptable looks for men. We every era has its boy band that has young men with, smooth skinned, often almost feminine looking, but that's a particular style of male beauty. But we also accept men when they look older, think Sean Connery or George Clooney or someone like that. For women, we basically only have that youth image as a standard of beauty. And so political leaders are obviously always going to be a long way from that young image. And there's a great saying by philosopher Susan Sontag that for a woman, every grey hair, every line is seen as a defeat. And so I think that we're harsher on women's looks. And then the last element is we tend to think we can judge something about a woman's character by how she dresses. We think it speaks more. So a dishevelled man might just be an eccentric, but we still judge him on other aspects of what he does. Think Boris Johnson. Whereas a dishevelled woman, people would think that said something deep about her character. Yeah. So all of these things are in play.
I suppose it's in the, if we took a broader look at that idea in the same way that when a woman is the victim of sexual violence, we often say, oh, well, what was she wearing? And that's suddenly relevant in the papers somehow. I wanted to ask a little bit more about clothes. I promise I'm not going to get too much into the clothing. How did the various women leaders that you interviewed for the book handle the scrutiny of how they looked and what they wore? And were there ever times where the somewhat more creativity of dress that they had actually was commented on in the positive?
Yes, there were. And the women we interviewed ranged from women not interested in fashion, who just saw all of this as kind of a grand distraction. They didn't want to be known for their clothes, compared with Theresa May in the United Kingdom, who across her life has always been interested in fashion. And it's one of the things that she speaks about. And when she first came to public attention, she gave a very hard-hitting speech at a Conservative Party conference, forcing the Conservative Party, then in opposition, to face up to a series of its own inadequacies. So it was a rallying cry shaping speech, and it certainly brought her name right into people's lounge rooms, and they thought for the first time that this was a person who might have prime ministerial capacity. But she gave that speech wearing leopard skin kitten heels, and so the press coverage was all about her putting her kitten heel down and that kind of stuff, lots of plays on words about the shoes. But she recounts in the book an instance where she's in the House of Commons, she's in a lift, there's a young woman in the lift, and she says to the young woman something like, oh, you're wearing very nice shoes. And the young woman says, look, I'm in politics because of your shoes. The first thing I ever noticed about politics was the coverage of what you were wearing. And once I got interested in that, I got interested in you, I got interested in politics, and here I am, I work in the House of Commons. So, that's a positive story. But for most of our women leaders, this was received as an extra burden, hard to get right, time consuming. Hillary Clinton estimated she spent 24 days all up, if you add up all the hair and makeup sessions during the 2016 presidential campaign, 24 days in hair and makeup, kind of crazy amounts of time. So overall, this differential emphasis on appearance was received by our women leaders as a net negative.
Now, if we move away from appearance, I promised I would, and we know that men and women leaders tend to be judged differently for the same behaviours. And in the book, you talk about that a man and a woman who behave in an identical fashion will be labelled very differently. The man might be powerful, the woman is annoying and domineering, for example. Ambitious is one of those words that we apply that to a young bloke and it's a great thing, and for women it's like a dirty, yucky, negative word. How do we combat that double standard? How deep-seated is it?
Oh, unfortunately, it's incredibly deep-seated, and we're all subject to it. I mean, a lot of the discussions that we have about gender equality and fighting for change, it would be pretty easy, I think, for people to leave those discussions thinking, the women know what they want to do, and what they really need to do is change men. Whereas what clearly comes out of the book is, and the research that we drew on for the book, is that women and men, all of us, you, me, all of us, we've got these gendered stereotypes in the back of our brains that are very deep-seated, and if we are unknowing about them, then they will shape how we respond to women leaders. And there was a fantastic piece of research by Yale University, got two groups of voters, two different lecture theatres, two groups of voters, got a man to do a candidate pitch to one group, a woman to do a candidate pitch to another group, elect me for the Senate because. They were actually both actors given a script, and the script was identical. And it contained lines like, I'm the kind of person who gets things done. I might step on other people's toes to deliver the job, but I always do. And when the man said that, fine. When the woman said that, a strong adverse reaction. And when the researchers wrote all of this up, they actually used words like revulsion, contempt, to describe the reaction of people to a woman who was owning power quite as visibly as that. So, these are really deep-seated, and we're never going to get rid of them until we start talking about them.
I want to move to, and I'm absolutely pushing through this book very, very fast, everyone, which is to leave you lots of space to actually buy the book and have a read and get much deeper than I have a chance to tonight. I am racing through at tremendous speed. Julia, I wanted to ask about the media's obsession with the reproductive choices of women leaders in a way that they simply, I shouldn't say they, I'm part of the media, in a way that they simply aren't of men's. I remember when Scott Morrison became Prime Minister, he had these two gorgeous daughters in primary school, and it barely rated a mention in the papers that he was dad to two young daughters. Would he had time for them? How would he be around the house to look after them? Who would cook them dinner? What did you find in your research about women leaders and their motherhood status?
Well before I came to write the book with Ngozi, I had worked out that there is no right answer to the question, do you have children? If you're a woman in public life, a woman with a leadership responsibility, because if you say yes, then the next question is, who's looking after them? I mean, how can you get to do all of this when you've got kids? And colleagues of mine that I went through with, women like Tanya Plibersek, who is still there, Nicola Doxon, who had their families when we were in Parliament together, were routinely asked those kinds of questions. Whereas men that I was in Parliament with who had kids of exactly the same age were never asked those questions, because it was just assumed that somewhere they had a non-working wife or a part-time working wife who was just going to make all of that happen for them. So if you say, yes, I do have kids, that's a problem. If you say, no, I don't have kids, then that's a problem, because you seem to be out of touch with sort of mainstream life if you don't have your own children. And we dealt with that in the book, asked women about their experiences. Of course, Jacinda Ardern becoming a mum while she's Prime Minister, only the second woman to do so, right through to a discussion of Theresa May's experiences. Theresa May is childless, but not by choice. She and her husband tried to have children and were unable to do so, and how people reacted to that. So it reinforced in me that we still feel like we can get into the commentary more around women and their families, and we can make judgments on who they are based on whether or not they have children.
This is a bit of a prickly one, so I'm taking a deep breath. I think that often the people making those criticisms, the people who are most critical of women leaders, are often other women, or certainly as much as those criticisms come from men. And it is something that you look at in the book, this idea that a lot of women will say, when I've been in the workplace and I've had some what I felt like was sexist treatment, the worst of it's come from another woman. Can you tell us a little bit about scarcity and why it prompts women to see one another as competitors rather than collaborators?
Yeah, we drew on that wonderful statement that Madeleine Albright uses the whole time, which is that there's a special place in hell for women who don't support women. And we asked ourselves the question, how crowded is that special place in hell? And are we going there? We tried to work through that. And in doing so, we found some tendencies either way. I mean, there's been a sort of snapshot of the research that shows, you know, when a woman comes through on a corporate board or into senior management, that you don't easily get the second woman. And that has led to people concluding, well, the problem is the one woman who got through kind of pulls up the drawbridge and prevents another woman joining her because she likes the status of being the sort of the queen bee, the special one. But when we unpacked all of that, actually that phenomenon seems to be explained more by the fact that businesses, and that's who the study was on business organisations, that once they've got, you know, a woman, CEOs, etc., will say, look, gender, we've kind of done that. We can leave that alone now. Or if the convergence is, it's okay if you've got two women on your corporate board, but you don't need more than two, then they'll have two but get no more. But we didn't leave it at that. I mean, that would have been a heart-gladdening kind of answer in the sense that it wasn't the women who were causing the behaviour, but the male power structures. But we did dig a little deeper, and in digging a bit deeper again, I think we came to the conclusion that there is a scarcity kind of politics that has been implanted in us. We know that, you know, of a 10-person board, perhaps only 2 spots will be there for women, or maybe 3 spots. And so it means that it's easy to succumb to the sense that my competitor is the other woman, you know, that's who I need to knock off to get this spot. So women pitted against women rather than women coming together and saying, you know what, we're not going to play this game anymore. And if there are 10 spots, then 5 of them should go to women. And we use a beautiful quote that the politics of scarcity isn't our fault, but it is our problem. As women, we've got to confront it and talk about it and work out how we're going to overcome it.
Yeah, I think that's such a good answer, and I sit with that, and I think, oh, I'm not like that, and then I try and put myself in that position of being in a corporation, looking to the top, seeing a C-suite of 10 chairs, and there's one woman. My brain still does go, I've got to get me the woman spot, you know, as opposed to saying there's 10 spots. You know, there's lots to go around, and we know that women political leaders are still few and far between. Speaking with so many other women leaders for the course of your research for the book provide a sense of comfort or solidarity in the shared experience? I mean, there aren't many people you can say, hey, I've been a leader of a country and a woman too. Let's chat about that.
Yes, it did. And I've had that delightful experience of solidarity before when I was Prime Minister and going to things like the G20 that brings leaders together, or some of the UN meetings or whatever, and there would be other women there. We would gravitate towards each other and we often would have this conversation. So I knew that doing the interviews would be delightful and would give me an opportunity to feel that solidarity again. So I enjoyed them from that point of view. But the statistics about how few women are there are pretty, pretty concerning. When we look at countries around the world that pick their leaders, 70% have never had a woman lead, 70%. And it's only a very limited number of countries, 13, that have had 2 women. And there's only 2 countries, of which New Zealand's one, that have had 3 women lead. The other one's Iceland. So we've not only got to bust open that 70%, but we've got to make it quite routine for women to be leaders. And we were able to compare across the group of leaders we talked to what it's like to be number 3, which Jacinda is in New Zealand, what it's like to be number 2, because Erna Solberg is in Norway and Theresa May was in the United Kingdom, and what it's like to be the first. And there's no doubt that it becomes a bit easier each time there's a woman. And certainly Jacinda is very conscious that, you know, because New Zealand had Helen Clark for a long term and Jenny Shipley before that, that's a different environment for women leaders than a place where you're coming through as the first.
It's almost this sense that if you're the first leader who is a woman, you're not judged as a leader, you're judged as a woman one. Like, are the woman leaders any good? Whereas once you get to a few, you get to be judged for being you. Right.
I think that's increasingly true. And even for Jacinda at number 3, the gendered treatment is not zero, but it is less. And that should give us a lot of optimism, though, because it means we can crack this. We can make a difference by having more women come through.
Now, Malcolm Turnbull said in an interview recently that he thought that the abuse and criticism you endured as Prime Minister from some parts of the press in particular was off the charts. He never mentioned it at the time, though. And I wanted to ask you, what role do you think, what role do men have in starting to fix these gendered problems that we see, given that they're the ones that hold most of the power anyway?
Yeah, look, I think men can make a huge difference. And I was still grateful to Malcolm for making that observation now. And, you know, to be fair to him, I kind of misjudged the moment to raise all of this too. I should have raised it far closer to the start of my Prime Ministership. You know, I think men can be incredible agents of change. One, because those statistics, like, you know, 70% of the world hasn't had a woman leader, tell you that whether it's in politics, whether it's in business, whether it's in civil society, the law, the media, technology, men disproportionately have power, and they can use that power for change. So, you know, if they want to make a difference, they really can. But even for men who are not at that powerful leadership level, there are just simple behavioural changes that they can do every day that would make a real difference. We cite research in the book that shows if you've got 5 people sitting around trying to solve a problem, that women won't get a fair share of the talking time unless 4 out of the 5 are women.
Wow.
Or put another way, if there's more than one bloke in that group, women won't get a fair set of the talking time, a fair share. Well, men can change that. Men can change it partly by a little bit less talking, but also being conscious that, you know, as they look around the group, there's someone who hasn't said something, a woman who hasn't said something, and inviting her in for a contribution. And men can also make a difference calling out sexism. If we put that burden entirely on the shoulders of women, then we're actually asking the person who's probably got the least ability to respond in the moment. She may not have the power. She may already be profoundly discomforted by being treated unequally. We can't say, well, it's all you. You're the one who's got to do it, the woman. A man can do it. And the research actually shows if he does it, he will be listened to, because he'll be seen not to be raising something from self-interest, but something he's genuinely concerned about. And the other really good news for blokes is that people will mark them as up in things like performance reviews and climbing the corporate ladder, because he will be seen to have been the kind of person who's prepared to, you know, go in and do something because it's morally right, rather than just because it shows on his key performance indicators. So it really is all upside for men in getting to raise these issues.
I remember having a male friend of mine who's a lovely bloke, I feel like I need to say that to start off, say to me, I've never come to one of those International Women's Day things at work because I don't know, I wouldn't know what to say. And I really want to say exactly what you did, that you don't have to say anything. Listen, like that would be good. That would be helpful. Everyone at home, I want to give you the heads up that in just a couple of minutes, I am going to stop talking and let you have a chance at the questions and to put some questions to Julia Gillard. As you would have noticed, I am not coming to you, and nor is Julia, from a lovely stage in a lovely theatre somewhere in one of our beautiful capital cities to be able to chat to you. Instead, you know, I'm stuck in the bedroom at home. Julia's got a much nicer backdrop, and that is, of course, because of the horrific pandemic we're living through now. And Julia, I wanted to ask you about that. We're already seeing that women are more likely to be made redundant or have their hours reduced during this pandemic. Certainly in Australia, that's the case. And a lot of women it's showing in the participation rate figures already that they aren't necessarily actively looking for work either. So women's participation in work is dropping in the face of a recession. Do you think this pandemic threatens to set back women's equality? And if so, what do we do about that?
Yeah, look, I am worried about that. I can really see two futures in front of us, and unfortunately one of them is a pretty negative vision of the future. It's where we've gone backwards on women's equality because we've gone backwards on women's jobs, where we've gone backwards on equality because by the time governments get through this and they've got big debts on their balance sheet and they start looking to do cutbacks, we know from evidence around the world that austerity politics usually means that things women most need get cut back. And I'm also really concerned, and I've seen a few straws in the wind on this already, that big businesses that have been investing in diversity and equality might well be saying to themselves, oh, that's the kind of thing we do in the good times. We don't do it in the bad times. We haven't got enough corporate budget for that. So all of that makes me quite worried. What I can see, though, if we are to tread the path that takes us to the upside, I do think we are revaluing caring work. We all know that it's people in caring professions who are getting us through this, and I hope we get that sense of the true worth of those caring workers and take it with us to the days beyond the pandemic. Second, we're all becoming, technology experts, and businesses are finding new ways to work which are virtual and more flexible. And if we can take the best of that with us, not the extra burdens with homeschooling and the like, but the best of that with us, then I think we could, for many occupations, create new career styles that are better suited to women and better suited to anybody who's got family responsibilities. So I think there's, some downsides to navigate and some upsides to maximise.
Julia, Jared Warren has asked if there are any regrets from your time in office, and he's finished his comment with, "We still need you."
That's nice, and I'm not going to break into song, but I guess, regrets, I've had a few. Anybody who's lived a life probably can utter that sentence. And yes, there'd be some things that I did differently. I'd do this gender intervention differently. I'd try and start it earlier. There are things around how we communicated, putting a price on carbon, and argued for that I'd do differently. So yes, definitely. But, I live with the sense that, the past is the past and you never get to redo that. What you can do is you can help steer a different future. And I'm not in domestic politics now. That's a forum for others. But I can still use my energies and my activism to try and do some good things that will make a difference for the women who are yet to come. And so I'm very focused on that.
Julia, Ali Saar has asked whether you think there are any promising female leaders in the current Australian Parliament, regardless of party affiliation.
I've been asked this question before and I always duck it, and I'm going to disappoint you and disappoint her by doing it again, because staying out of domestic politics means that if I put my hand on anyone who's in there at the moment on either side, that would become a thing in the media, and I don't want to be involved in that. I just, for all women in there and for all political parties, it's really important that we keep encouraging more and more women. I'm in Labor because of our affirmative action rule. If you look at the national parliament, it's basically half-half. The Conservatives still have a fair way to go. And until women have a fair share of the backbench and then a fair share of the front bench positions, we're unlikely to see women routinely come through for leadership.
Narinda Panu has asked what advice you would give young girls who want to be a leader. We'll make them nameless young girls, so you don't have to say they'll be a future success.
Nameless young girls. Well, I'd say number one, go for it. That Ngozi and I, as we wrote the book, we were so clear that we wanted that to be the message of it. Go for it. But we don't want to insult any woman's intelligence by saying, and it'll all be fine. We want to say, go for it. but still know that there's going to be this differential treatment, and try and think in advance how you will counter and deal with that when it comes. And the book is really a manifesto to help women do that. That the last chapter has lessons for everyone, but it particularly has a set of lessons for aspiring women.
Munira Bano Sazabadza asked how long you think and how hard it will be for Australia to have a Prime Minister who is a woman of colour.
Well, I wish I could predict with... Yeah, it's a good question, and I wish I could predict with certainty the date. That would be a pretty good crystal ball, wouldn't it? But you know, we in the book do talk about, you know, what the theorists would refer to as intersectionality, women who have sexism to fight and racism to fight. The women leaders that we talk to didn't have that struggle in their own country, in the sense that there's no Barack Obama equivalent in these women leaders, someone who is from the non-dominant racial or ethnic group of their country. But we did interview African women leaders, Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf, Joyce Banda, Ngozi herself, my co-author, who were able to talk about what it's like to be a black woman who then goes into major international meetings and encounters the twin forces of sexism and racism and can be dismissed because of who they are and the colour they are. So we do try and talk about that, and try and offer some encouragement for women of colour to come through. I'm obviously not the best person to talk about how to combat racism, but I hope through Ngozi's input and wise words that women reading the book do find some encouragement around how to combat racism as well as how to combat sexism.
And it's hard to find a question in amongst all the beautiful comments full of praise. So I hope you get a moment later, Julia. I know how busy you are, but to go back and read some of them, because there are some really generous comments there. So much reflection on the NDIS, on the attempts to have a price on carbon that would last. Lots of praise for your education work continuing, and also when you were Prime Minister. Linda McAllery-Smith has asked, who was the first female leader that you noticed and who may have inspired you?
Yeah, the first, well, I guess the first female leader I noticed was Margaret Thatcher, because, you know, I was born in the United Kingdom. We're Welsh, we migrated to Australia, but my father in particular was very politically interested and still followed the politics of the United Kingdom. He was a Labor man to his bootstraps, so Margaret Thatcher was not his cup of tea in any way, shape or form. And, you know, he's from a coal mining community in South Wales, and given the miners' strike and everything else, Margaret Thatcher, normally a few words one wouldn't repeat on Facebook were used before the noun Thatcher in our household. But at least, you know, as a girl, at least I saw that a woman could end up being a Prime Minister. And I remember noting that because it hadn't happened before. You know, growing up in Australia, I'd only seen men. But in terms of having a really shaping impact on me, that would be Joan Kirner, who was, of course, the first female Premier of Victoria, who I knew well and personally, and I got to learn a great deal from her, and she was a great mentor and friend for the rest of her life.
Ris Lung has asked, Julia, if you could talk about your current work promoting education.
Sure. I'm chair of the Global Partnership for Education, which is the major multilateral fund that supports school education in developing countries. So we work with almost 70 countries. They're the poorest places on earth. 2/3 of them are in Africa, but some are in our region of the world as well, places like Papua New Guinea. And the mission is to try and make sure that every boy and every girl gets a good quality school education. And when we look at who's missing out on that at the moment, disproportionately, it's girls. At the moment, the work of the Global Partnership for Education has been profoundly changed by COVID. Developing countries like us have had periods of school closure. And what we know from earlier epidemics like the Ebola epidemic that hit countries in Africa is if schools close, then often the most marginalised girls never go back. They end up at real risk of early marriage, of child marriage. They end up at risk of teenage pregnancy. They end up at risk of child labour, and they don't go back. So GPE has mobilised a $500 million fund to try and support countries during this period and to try and have special programs to make sure that the marginalised children return. And this is in settings where, you know, I know homeschooling's a big dilemma for parents in Australia, but we've got internet connectivity, computers, all of that. These are countries with none of those advantages, none of that infrastructure.
Julia, Emma Gill has asked, what is the one thing that each of us can do to be agents of change for Australian women?
I think it's so hard to pick one thing, but I would say always second guess your images of women leaders, and that doesn't have to be high-level political leaders. It could be the manager in your workplace. It could be the woman who's in charge of the store where you're shopping. When you're judging that woman, just ask yourself one more question. Do I really think that, or is that the gender stereotype in the back of my brain? Do I really think she's not very likeable? Is it really fair of me to conclude that, or is that the stereotyping talking?
Everyone, I want to thank you for your wonderful questions, and I'm sorry we haven't had a chance to get to all of them. I've gone well over time because I've been very selfish. Julia, one last one. You counsel women reading this book of yours that women should be aware, not beware. And I know that you want to inspire women to seek out leadership positions in politics and more generally. But sometimes I'm not sure that enthusiasm matches the despondency of some of the factual findings in the book. And I have to ask, would you do the job again?
Oh, 100%, absolutely. If you somehow had a magic wand, Jamila, if you had a magic wand, you might want to use it for a whole series of other things before you got to this. But if you had an unlimited magic wand and you could send me back in time and the instruction was, you know, it's all going to play out exactly the same way, I'd still say, yes, Jamila, wave that wand. I'm happy to do it again, 100%.
I'm very pleased to hear that. Julia Gillard, I wish you could hear the enormous applause that you would be getting if we were in a theatre or a hall or a stadium, as we should be. But for now, you're just going to have to take mine.
and to you too.
All the people who are watching. Everybody, this is the book, which I'm going to try and hold up so it doesn't get terrible light on it. Women and Leadership, which of course Julia has co-authored with her partner Ngozi. Julia, thank you so much to you. Thank you to Dymocks and Chapter 1 for hosting us this evening. We really appreciate it. Now, folks, the most important thing you can be doing, especially those of you in Melbourne in lockdown 2, is reading. So scroll up to the top of this feed. At the top of it, Dymocks has got a link where you can grab a copy of the book. You can get reading. I promise I have only just scraped the surface this evening. There is so much in there, great data, great stories, and some really funny stories from the women that Julia has interviewed and, of course, from Julia herself. Thank you very much, everybody, and good night.
Thank you.